working with things that are artificial, but not have any particular feelings about nature. You could also think that what people do that is not simply a consequence of their animal natures is bad. Or you could think that it's sort of neutral, but that what is natural is positively good. So that's the kind of thing that I had in mind. Okay, so what is Goldman's central point? Goldman's central point is that previous analyses of sexual desire, including Aquinas and Nagel, make a mistake because they define sex and sexual desire in terms of something other than itself. So what he objects to is the means-end structure of the analyses of both somebody like Aquinas. Sex is just a means to reproduction, and everything else follows from that. And Nagel's. Sex is, in essence, a kind of phenomenological experience focused on the dynamic of mutual reinforcement, and that's why it's good. So what Goldman wants to say is both of these are importantly mistaken. And they're importantly mistaken because they miss out on sex in itself. Well, so what is sex in itself? It's true that both Aquinas and Nagel start off by giving you an analysis which is in terms of what sex is for, in a way, which is something other than itself. And then that's assumed to be normal and therefore good. And so whether it's biologically or phenomenologically defined, sex has its value as a derivative value from something else which is intrinsically valuable. Now, he also claims that this is a species of essentialism, and that's true, because it certainly is true that both of these people, both Aquinas and Nagel, however different their analysis may be, they both give us a means-end analysis, which is essentialist, because it's grounded in the thought that we can identify the core of sexual experience, in the case of Nagel, or the biological function of sex, in the case of Aquinas. Now, the first thing that might occur to one about whether this is a legitimate criticism is that maybe to define something in terms of its function is not such a bad thing. Because after all, most things that we deal with have a nature that we understand as deriving from what they do, from their function, what they're for. What is a clock? What is a pen? What is a computer? What is a car? What is a chair? What is a table? Every one of these things, all artifacts, we would define in terms of the point of having them, the use that they are to us. So, for most artifacts, you can't really say much about what they are without saying what they're for. And that would suggest that a blanket stricture on any kind of teleological or means and analysis isn't necessarily one that can be justified, remembering that, after all, while of course we're not artifacts, we understand biological organisms in terms of artifacts, and very often we understand our own mental states in terms of what these mental states can do for us, in terms of what they can bring to our lives. Furthermore, somebody could claim that Goldman is himself something of an essentialist in a couple of ways. To begin with, he assumes in a kind of essentialist way that sex is for pleasure. Well, that seems to be both somewhat essentialist and somewhat teleological. You can look up on the web reasons for having sex, and you'll find a site that tells you that people have tabulated 237 reasons that people give for having sex. Now, if people give 237 reasons for having sex, getting into, reproduction might be one out of 237, and getting into the kind of feedback loop that we get in Nagel might be another, but that still leaves 235 different reasons for having sex. Now, these reasons might be ones that we think of as extrinsic. If you did it for money, if you did it for comfort, if you did it, in various ways that are different from the inherent pleasure of sex. But nevertheless, it is somewhat essentialist to say, but it only counts if you're doing it for pleasure. Yes, you had a question?
Sorry, what's essentialism again?
Essentialism, in general, is any view that says that you can capture the necessary and sufficient conditions for being something of that kind. So, and that if you are a thing of that kind, but only if you are a thing of that kind, are you characterized by those traits. So, for example, when we discussed gender last week, I discussed Jordan Peterson's view of gender in that little clip of his called Gender Forever, in which manifestly he takes the view that if I'm looking at you or you or you, there's one thing I can say that is essential about you, that is part of what defines you as the person you are, and that is your gender. Now, the issue of essentialism is a very much one that's been debated in the past 50 years among feminists, among other things, among other people, not just between feminists and others, but among feminists, because some people have taken the view that men and women are indeed essentially different. That is to say that and this has been taken as a view both favoring and countering some people's desire to change their sex. Some people might say, if you're a man, there's no way in which you can become a woman, because a man's essence is what it is, and a woman's essence is radically different, and therefore you can never become the other. But of course, for the person who actually does want to transition from one sex to another, we can leave aside here the question of whether this should be called gender or sex transition. They might say, yeah, exactly, that's my point. My essence is that I am a man, and I just happen to be born with the anatomy and perhaps the chromosomes of a woman, but that's just a mistake because my essence, my inner essence really is to be a man. Right? You can see how essentialism could work both ways, and how people could fight on both sides of practically every dispute in this area, both as essentialists and anti-essentialists. Now, I made bold at the very beginning of the course to say, okay, I define myself as a feminist, and I define feminism, as I understand it, precisely as anti-essentialism. That is to say, as the view that you may well have your own individual essence, something that makes you, you, and nobody else is you. That's not something that could ever be captured simply by the fact that you are male or that you are female. And therefore, from the fact that you're male or female, absolutely nothing else follows. Whereas if you're an essentialist, you will be disposed to accept arguments that begin because you are a woman. That's a reason for treating you differently, requiring something different from you, expecting something different from you. Because you are a man, that's a sufficient reason for requiring something of you, expecting something, etc. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very important question, what essentialism means. In this particular case, it is a more restricted issue because we're not trying to define the essence of a person, we're trying to define the essence of what counts as sexual desire. So, two assumptions that appear to be essentialist in this sense for Goldman. One is that it's not going to count as real sexual desire unless the desire is a desire for pleasure. Secondly, that it must involve two people. And that would seem to exclude solitary sex, and he never even raises the possibility of sex with more than one person. And if you think that sex is essentially something that is a pursuit of pleasure among just two people in certain ways, then it seems to exclude certain cases that from other points of view would appear equally central or equally typical or equally allowable as examples of sex, whatever you may think about their morality or anything like that. So the advantage of Goldman's view, which you'll remember is called, his article is called Plain Sex. The advantage of that kind of view is that it attempts to define a common, lowest common denominator, the thing that every case of desire has in common with every other. And I think that in general that strategy is a very good idea, because it's a very good idea not to give the impression that when you define sex, you already are included a certain evaluative language. So if you, and this goes as when we discuss things like pornography later, or prostitution, you'll see that I think it's very important that if we want to disentangle questions about the morality, the value, or whatever it is of activities like prostitution, or activities like BDSM, say, and you already define them as perversions. The word perversion is a pejorative word. The very word perversion sort of means that you have strayed from the right way. And so if you define them as perversions, and indeed that's going to be my objection to Goldman's own attempt to define perversions in an acceptable way, you're going to be including the evaluative judgments as part of the definition. And in that case, you're not going to be able to make a distinction between those cases where somehow the same activity is one to be praised or